Hi, this is Mike Watt. I'm the editor of Exploitation Nation, and this is my Mr. Media interview.
Exploitation Nation, Mike Watt's biannual journal in which he gives lowbrow entertainment a highbrow survey, is all about underground comics in its 6th issue. Now, I'm always looking for an excuse to feature comics-related subjects on Mr. Media, so seeing previous Mr. Media guests Howard Cruz and Trina Robbins on the cover, plus art by Will Eisner, whose authorized biography I am obligated to mention I wrote 15 years ago, it was a pretty easy reach for me. In fact, there is a story inside about Eisner that I edited and reviewed as a favor for Watts some time ago, not realizing it was actually intended for Exploitation Nation, so that was a fun surprise. Another topic that caught my eye was a look back on the controversial underground comics of Mike Diana, who was a local First Amendment sensation here in the Tampa Bay area 2 decades ago with his comic Boiled Angel. And my friend Chuck Shepard, the longtime nationally syndicated News of the Weird columnist and a former lawyer, covered the trial for alternative newspapers at the time, so I'm always aware that he's interested in the subject. This issue also remembers the late National Lampoon magazine artist Vaughn Baudet and has a piece about comics artist Steve Bissette. So I've invited Mr. Watt here to talk about Exploitation Nation and hopefully introduce its content to a few new readers. You can find all 6 issues available for sale on Amazon.com. As for Watt, he is a writer, journalist, and screenwriter whose work has appeared in Fangoria, Film Threat, The Dark Side, Cinefantastique, Femme Fatale, and Sirens of Cinema. He also edited the 40th anniversary printing of Paul Schrader's Taxi Driver screenplay, which features a new interview with Robert De Niro. And Mike Watt, welcome to Mr. Media.
Well, thank you very much.
Mike, I'm looking at this issue. You're clearly a man of many interests, and I think I kind of knew that from our connection on Facebook in the past.
Right.
So let's start with an introduction to Exploitation Nation by its editor. What is the focus of the publication? What is its raison d'etre, and what makes it stand out from the field?
It's an interesting question. The magazine itself got started. I was working a crummy day job. I had just wrapped Taxi Driver, and I wanted a new project. I was editing Pete Chiarella's Grindhouse Purgatory, which has a very niche audience with the Grindhouse and the exploitation and stuff. And I really wanted to do something where I could bring in all the writers I worked with over the years as an editor. And I wanted to talk about movies to a greater extent than what we were doing with anything else. And it was frustrating, but the entire magazine got started within about 3 hours. By the end of the day, we had the first magazine plotted out while I was working my day job. Just the magic of the internet, Messenger, we got stuff going, and we're all film historians to a degree, if that's a valid description. We like to dive in deep. I often find stories about making a movie more interesting. I wrote 4 books called Movie Out, and that's what I was doing. I would take a film and I would try to break it down contextually to give you an overall, not just more than just a review, but what did it go through to be made. And I really want to do that more frequently. The books are big, they're unwieldy, they're difficult for me to do. So if I have more people to come and share the blame, I mean the credit, it became a very interesting experience. I don't know, do you know Ken Knight? He worked for Hollywood Book and Post. He's become a good friend of mine. He's a bookseller, and he recommended that we do a book on just lesbian vampire girls. And I thought, all right, well, we'll see if that works. And that's what we did. The first issue was all about lesbian vampires. But I tried to eliminate the salaciousness of it.
Then what's the wait? What's the point?
Yeah. Most of my career has been spent with not meeting people's expectations. One of the first short films we did was a movie called Were Girl, about a woman who turns into a lesbian in the full moon, and there's no sex in it whatsoever. It was a parody of those erotic movies that just made people nuts. So we tend to piss people off by trying to have something to say. So that was the point with Exploitation Nation, is how do I talk about this genre without being puerile about it? Yeah, and that's where it sort of spun off from there. How do we take a topic that most people would look at and just turn their nose up at it and make it interesting and palatable? And we dove into the history of lesbian vampires, starting with Sheridan Le Fanu and some of the stuff Stoker had done. We tried to bring it up through the Hammer the period and stuff, beyond just the Camp Motion Pictures erotica vampire movies. We wanted to do something beyond that. And that's where it sort of spun off. The second issue, the writers decided they wanted to do like the Bigfoot movies and cryptids, which that's a subject I had no interest in whatsoever, but they did. And we have a really solid issue with that one as well. That's again a subject I had no input in whatsoever, so I had to sit there in Boggy Creek, which if Steve Bissett is watching, he's going to hate me for saying, but it's the whole movie. It's Louisiana swamp, and then something in the shadows at the end, and yay, it's the best Bigfoot movie ever. I could not have cared less, but people seem to like it.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. Should I make a note to block Steve Bissett right now so he can't see? Never mind.
He's gonna hate me one way or another anyways. I love Steve and I go back forever, so interviewing him was actually kind of a nice transition for the magazine. We talked for like 2 hours, just about his history and stuff he'd done. Anything that didn't have to do with Moore or Swamp Thing. That's all that I wanted to talk about, and I'm sure he probably appreciated that.
Right.
But each issue is just something that even if I'm not interested in, I think I have a huge swath of really intelligent film people, like people who really it's beyond geekery. It's almost I don't want to say academic because it makes it sound stuffy, but that's really what a lot of us are. Is we are filmmakers. We are consumers of this stuff, and we like to see what's going on beyond the surface of it. Like I said, most movies have much more interesting stories on how they got made than the actual film. So that's what we're trying to do with Exploitation Nation. And the Comix thing was just because I felt like I wanted to talk to Steve. And I have a magazine, so let's give me a reason to talk to him. And I wanted to hang out with Mark Baudet for a while, So and his father was Von Baudet was a big influence on me growing up. I have a magazine, I can do this. Hey, do you mind if I republish this? When you spend 20 years as a journalist, you develop sort of an immunity to calling people. So if I want to call somebody and do an interview, well, yeah, I have this now, and I have this amount of experience, and people don't tend to hang up on me as quickly anymore.
I completely understand. I just retold the story a few days ago. I did a book years ago with the founders of the Home Depot, of all things. And while I'm working on it, I found out that Frank Borman, I don't know if you'll know that name, but Frank Borman was on their board of directors. Frank Borman was an astronaut who piloted Apollo 8 around the moon. He was the first pilot to take a rocket around the moon. They didn't land in that one, but I was like, I have an excuse to go meet Frank Borman. Yeah. So I asked my contact who was helping me coordinate things at Home Depot. I said, "Can you arrange an interview with Frank Borman when I'm in Atlanta next?" "Yeah, sure. He's here all the time." So we sat down, and I think of all the people that I've interviewed over the years, whether rock stars or actors or authors, whatever it is, I was completely gaga over this guy who, he was an astronaut. He was like the first guy to take a ship around the moon. And I was just like, wow. Yeah. And it was totally an excuse because, the book could have been written without him. There's no doubt. I admit it, Mr. Borman and Mr. Borman's family. I admit I took up an hour of your time for absolutely no reason but my own appeasement. So anyway, I know what you're saying.
And chances are I've rarely gotten death threats after an interview. Generally I make friends after the interviews. Issue 3 was our Bizarro film issue, and that came about because I'd been chasing Steven Sayadian for years. Red Stream, who directed Dr. Caligari and Cafe Flesh. I'm a big fan of his forever. I would make random phone calls if I could figure out, he had a bunch of different pseudonyms, so I was chasing him forever. And when I'd finally given up on ever getting in touch with this poor man, he calls me out of the blue. Apparently, a friend of his had told him that I was looking for him. We sat down, we had a long 3-hour conversation that was only partially interview. Most of it was just me babbling with this man. We had a great time. We're friends to this day. But if I didn't have this magazine, it would have just been a conversation, which is great for me. I value it. But, how can I boast to everyone else that I did this?
Well, so in choosing subject matter, how rare or unusual or cultish does something have to be to qualify for Exploitation Nation attention?
Well, that's the fun thing is the word exploitation was strictly a keyword that I found. I Googled a bunch of searchable terms that were like grindhouse or grindhouse preparatory, came up with exploitation. I like the word nation. I like the alliteration of that. That's it. Exploitation has rarely come into our fold when we're writing. We pick whatever topics we think are interesting. Mm-hmm. I like to try and set stuff that's rare. But when we did our rock and roll issue, how do you not talk about Phantom of the Paradise? How do you not talk about shock treatment or Terry Tom's enormous thing on beach movies, on the beach party movie, Frankie and that? How could I not put that in there in a rock and roll issue? So it doesn't necessarily have to be exploitation proof. I just want you to present something to me that's interesting. And I learned so much with each issue. I'm not kidding. I have really great writers. A guy I only through Cinema Wasteland, his name's Jason Lane, has consistently entertained me with articles he writes on his phone. and they're marvelous, and they're formatted funky, and they really get a kick out because he's always bringing me something that I didn't know.
Wow.
And that's what I like about all the people that I brought in is they're smart, and I don't need to know stuff. I like to discover too. It's one of the fun about being in the film industry. You're constantly discovering stuff. And I used to get irritated if I thought something I'd never heard of before, but now it's a present. I sit down, whether I like it or not, it's a new discovery. Well, so, that's what we're trying to do.
So, I'm just trying to get a sense of your own taste in these things. Do you prefer, are you particularly interested in small movies, obscure movies, horror? Is there any way to define your own taste in film?
I'm not a big fan of industrial films. I'm not a big fan of people walking through factories and showing me machinery. Anything else I'm open to.
Wow.
Yeah. I do not limit anybody. If you want to write about something, you can justify it. Please, by all means, sell it to me. If it works, I'll find a place for it.
Okay. Now, so coming back to issue 6, which is the latest one, as we sit here in the spring of 2019. Let's kind of walk through some of the major features in here. And again, so most of the issues to this point have been film related, right? Not comics related.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so this is probably going to stand out for that reason alone.
There are film reviews. A lot of comic related film reviews are in there. And there's I don't have the issue in front of me. I can't actually remember what else in it.
That's all right. Let's talk first about Mike Diana, who I'm sure 99% of people who will see this will have no idea who we're talking about. So, yeah, it's a shame. He certainly had a moment, not necessarily a good moment in many ways, but tell people about Mike Diana and why he's in this issue and what stands out about him.
Okay, Mike Diana, and I'm not even going to try to attempt the dates. I'm going to say I think it was in the mid '90s. He was a kid who was drawing his own Xeroxed comic books, and he was dealing with a lot of emotional stuff. So the drawings themselves they're hard to explain. They're gross. They're disturbing. There's often a lot of child abuse. There's often a lot of sexual connotation with children. It was a way of he says he's never been molested. I have no reason to disbelieve him, but he's definitely working out some sort of horrifying issue with these things. They were Xerox. They were mailed out throughout the country. I don't think even in Tampa issues had been sold. But one undercover cop managed to find it, and he tried to tie him in with a serial killer that had gone through Florida. And on that, even though he was clear, Mike was cleared of this, they still decided to haul him in for obscenity. And this, all right, by the time the trial comes around, it's in the 2000s, and we're having obscenity trials in America. Not only that, he's convicted. He's convicted of obscenity, and part of his probation, he served some time, but he didn't have a lengthy stretch. Part of his probation was he wasn't allowed to draw anything, even for his own use. And that's what his parole officer would check. Are you drawing? No, I'm not drawing. And that, to me, is a travesty of justice, and he's always been a First Amendment hero of mine because of that. Most of my First Amendment heroes are not people I like personally. I don't like Howard Stern personally, but he's a First Amendment hero. Mm-hmm. Mike, especially, because that's the only other word he again is travesty. There was no right for the judge to hand down sentences, and it followed him everywhere. He wasn't allowed to leave Florida, so he snuck out. He snuck to New York. And he lived there in New York as an artist, and a lot of people, including his friends, didn't know what he'd gone through. Only his family was aware of it. And I had first heard about it in an old comic scene. Probably the first time I heard of the Comic Legal Defense Fund was this story. And it was really important to me, if I'm going to do a book on underground comics in any, I know that usually fits about the 60s and 70s, but in any case, he had to be in there. It was absolutely imperative. And fortunately, Frank Henenlotter, who's become a good friend of mine, put me in touch with Mike, and we had a great conversation. And Frank's documentary, which I have not seen, it's driving me nuts, is you should be able to tell the world about this terrible story that Mike went through. Well, however you feel about his art is neither here nor there. Art is subjective. Art is supposed to be confrontational. I find his stuff really hard to look at. It's not my thing, but his story was, and I thought it was important to tell this story.
And how is Mike Diana doing today? What is he doing today?
He's an artist. He's a working artist. He's selling. I think that's his main income, selling artwork. He had a showing in Berlin. I think he had recently a showing in New York in a gallery. He seems to be doing pretty well. He's kind of a strange guy, but I liked him. We got along on the phone, and 2 or 3 times I met him.
Is he I hate to say it, like, happy at last, but is the man happy? Does he seem comfortable in his skin these days?
He seems perfectly comfortable. He's a very quiet guy. He's very forthcoming in interviews, but when you're just talking to him face to face, he demurs to you. He'll ask you a question to get you talking. He seems happy enough. He didn't kill himself while we were talking, which I always take as a good sign.
That's a good sign. He having been in the media in the Tampa Bay area, he lived in Largo, Florida, in the middle of Pinellas County, which is about 15-20 miles from where I live. I was familiar with it when Boiled Angel came out. I just couldn't believe. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I can't look at the images personally. They're very disturbing. I always worried about what was going on inside the man, but I never felt like there was a reason to tell him he couldn't publish. That's the kind of thing I always believe that the market should decide. As long as you're not putting things in front of children,
right,
and you take some care not to let that happen. I always feel like the market should decide those things. If there's no market for someone's art, whether it be comics or movies or TV or books, whatever, then you won't make a living at it, and you'll have to do something else. But being in Florida, this is where we have the Florida. it's been going on for the 30, 40 years that I've been down here. It's insane, what some decisions are. But when the judge told him he could not draw, I thought that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So, yeah, I mean, I'm glad to see him. I hope he's doing well.
He seems to be. He seems to be. For those who aren't familiar, and I don't know if I coined this phrase, I'm perfectly happy to take the credit for it, but I'm certain it's not mine, is I refer to his art as Hieronymus Bosch's refrigerator art. That's what I mean. Simple line drawings that are just horrific.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about another aspect of the magazine.
Okay.
I think that we share an interest in Von Baudet.
Yeah.
I remember I had a subscription to National Lampoon all through high school in the 70s, all through college. I think it finally wore me out in the early 80s when it just wasn't what it used to be. But boy, right. There were some, and there've been a lot. If anyone's interested in the National Lampoon of that era, search the Mr. Media archive. There've been a lot of interviews on the show relative to that, included with Rick Meyerowitz, who did a big coffee table book on that. But I always looked forward to Baudet's work. I never understood it. I didn't understand in the 70s and early 80s. I had no sense of that there were different forms of sexuality, of gender. I didn't understand things that were shades of things. I just had no exposure to it. And so there's a lot that went way over my head at the time. But I always found his art fascinating. I always found his perspective fascinating. Now, I think you mentioned you spent time with Mark Baudet, who his son, is that right? Nephew?
It's his son. Mark is his son. Yes.
Okay.
I think is his only son. I'm not 100% sure if Mark has siblings or not. I've spoken to Mark on the phone, and I've dealt with him mostly through email, but I followed him because I was a fan of his father's. And my dad growing up had maybe a handful of undergrounds, a lot of Gilbert Shelton stuff, but he had 3 or 4 issues of Dunkelwaffel and Deadbone. Yeah, the Deadbone collection, and that's where I discovered him. That's when I realized there were different kinds of undergrounds. It wasn't just ugly hippies having sex.
There's a lot of that, though.
There's a lot of that, but in Bonds, it was lizards, a hat, and naked women having sex. So, and I enjoyed the fantasy of Bonds, and I loved his world building, and I loved the idea that there was stuff happening in between the strips. You nothing against the Freak Brothers. I love the Freak Brothers, but you figure their adventure sort of ended with the end. Mm-hmm. With Bond stuff, most of his strips are open-ended. A lot of them were released posthumously incomplete. I know that Mark finished, I want to say Sunpot was the first thing that he worked on, the first lizard in space. And when I was growing up as a confused adolescent who didn't want to be associated with the jocks and didn't want to be out with the date rapists, knowing about these other types of genders and these other kinds of sexuality and things that were confusing me as a pubescent young man were not brought into sharp focus, but at least explained to me as wasn't horrifying. The piece that I republished, his Confessions of a Cartoon Guru, it's a stream of consciousness piece, but he gets pretty honest about where his bents are, and intellectually, sexually, emotionally, and that kind of honesty was something rare for me to see. Plus, I'm 15, so this feels forbidden still. For this recovering Catholic prepubescent man, or post-pubescent at this point, but. And plus, he sort of remained underground. Even the people I knew who knew underground stuff didn't know Bond stuff all that well. So, again, it was important. Not only was it important to me, but it would be fun for me to have a Cheech Wizard cover. So it sort of starts with, what will make me happy? How do I achieve this? And who can I torture to make this happen?
I get that. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Yeah, I when you mentioned, it's funny, I hadn't thought about this in years. You mentioned that sometimes the comics would be published, and they wouldn't have an end, and sometimes not a beginning. They just picked up and there was a chunk of something. That explains, and I hadn't thought about this in decades, but that explains why I was always left like, wait, what? Nothing, nothing happened here. Nothing was resolved. Nothing. Yeah, that's quite true. And when I think of Baudet, I also think of, and they're not related in any way, but Keith Haring, who I think was the next generation. I think he followed Baudet. I think Baudet was largely 70s, and I think Haring kind of owned the 80s.
That
Right?
sounds about right.
They're very unique to their generations in terms of
Yeah.
their style and perspective. It's just someone I always found Haring equally fascinating with his art. And again, I just liked both of their work for what it was. I had no idea. I mean, I just didn't understand all the other stuff that was going on. I'm a very surface kind of guy. I think anyone who knows me will attest that. Oh, there's a deeper level. I don't think Bob will ever get that.
I avoid the surface entirely, personally.
Yeah, see, that's a big difference. I mean, it's just where I am. Interesting though. Now, you also have in the and one of the things I should say before we get on to Howard Cruz and Trina Robbins, who both of whom I know and I adore. I think with a lot of people, when they think back to Undergrounds, they're thinking, okay, there's going to be a feature on Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and Dennis Kitchen, who we talked about, and some of the real obvious people. You didn't do that, which I really respect. You've got a really good, and I think survey is the best word for it, because it touches on a lot of aspects of underground comics. And for folks who are just hearing this or watching, that's comics with an X to separate from Marvel comics or DC comics, things like that. It's underground, it's adult. It tend to be sex and very puerile in many ways, although that's not the way that Mr. Watt approaches it. He doesn't see it that way. He doesn't work on that. But yeah, and then I think you could say that Howard Cruz, who's best known as the founding editor of Gay Comics, I think in the 60s or 70s, and then Trina Robbins, who is known for featuring women comics, and something I didn't know about her until many years later was that she was married to Steve Leialoha, whose name I probably just butchered, but was a major artist on the Howard the Duck comics in the original run. So they're each very different. They each have a unique niche. How did Trina and Howard wind up being featured in Exploitation Nation?
Howard was a given as far as I was concerned. I couldn't. As you said, you expected Crumb and you expected Gilbert Shelton. Well, I had no access to Gilbert, and I was certain Crumb wouldn't want to talk to me because I'm another human being.
That's as good an excuse as any. Yeah, I think you're probably right about that.
So I wanted to talk to people who would talk to me, basically. And Howard was a Facebook friend, but Howard was the first underground cartoonist I knew art-wise, because I grew up reading the Warren reprints of The Spirit. And they were also published. It was Dennis. It was the Kitchen Sink reprints. Dennis was publishing some of the Barefoot stuff, and I recognized Cruz's art just from that. So if I would go to a comic book store and saw Barefoots or Wendell, I recognized it right off the bat. It wasn't Eisner; it was the other guy. So that was important to me, and the fact that he was one of the first, if not the first, out gay cartoonist out there, and not doing sex stories. He was telling, I think they used a quote that somebody said to him, "Wow, gay people are just like me. We go to the grocery store, we buy gas for our car," and I wasn't aware of just how much of his stuff was influenced by the LSD and his crazy stuff. I was more interested in the day-to-day stuff that he was doing, in the Wendell comics and Stuck Rubber Baby. So he was a no-brainer for me, and he was so lovely. We could have talked forever. I just ran out of things to ask him after a certain point. Trina, I had interviewed for Femme Fatale back in 2000. Oh no, even before that. Femme Fatale, probably 2000 is when I interviewed her, And she was real busy at the time with a lot of anti-Trump stuff, with women's marches, so we didn't have an opportunity to talk more. I asked her a couple of questions through Facebook to flesh out the piece. But it was important. She was one of the strongest voices of women in comics out there. She was the first one to publish lesbian comics. She said the only failing they had with things like an Amy, they couldn't find any black lesbian cartoonists to represent, but otherwise everyone was pretty much represented. And I think that it's fascinating. She was the first woman to draw Wonder Woman, but not until the 90s.
Right.
So 60 years of only men drawing Wonder Woman. So again, it was a no-brainer for me if I'm going to talk about the history, then I need to talk about these different things. And they're both lovely people. They need to have parades in their honor before they're no longer with us. And I think their work is important. And if they are a little underread, then maybe it's my duty to try and fix it.
Okay. And then one more topic that I have to ask you about for this issue. And there's other things in the magazine, folks. I'm just picking on the things that really stood out to me. Is, of course, the piece that you did on Will Eisner and the Undergrounds. And you know, today, first of all, there's not a lot of people who even know who Eisner is when you get outside of the core comics industry. But there was this period of time where Dennis Kitchen Sink Press, who was one of the kings of underground publishing in the 60s and 70s, was publishing Will Eisner's, republishing The Spirit, and then had this crazy notion where he started connecting Eisner with, well, actually, and it started the day they met, as I recall from the book. He connected Eisner with underground comics artists, and they found some common ground, which was so weird because Eisner is this guy. He smoked a pipe which had tobacco in it, not the stuff that Kitchen and the other guys smoked. He would wear a jacket and tie everywhere he went. He was very straight-laced. He was an establishment guy up and down, but there was something about him that connected with the underground. So how did Eisner make it into this issue?
Oh, that's simple. I wanted a Spirit cover. That's it. I wanted to do two covers. If I wanted a Cheech and I wanted a Spirit. That's totally it. And actually, I had played with doing the cover of just the artwork without the Snarf masthead from Snarf #3 that Dennis was so generous in letting me republish. And I thought, this man's doing me a favor. I should at least get both of them in there. So I just republished the cover of Snarf 3 on the cover of my magazine, basically, so I could have the best of both worlds. But again, if I'm going to do anything on comic books, Will is one of my personal heroes. And I use hero a lot, but he is, he guided me through an awful lot. He was so sweet to us when we met. And I met him 6 months before he died. So I was really, really lucky to have gotten to meet him. I got to interview him for Hell Notes, I think. He hit on my wife. What he said was they don't make gals like you anymore. So it's, but I absolutely, and I very rarely met anyone who knew Will who didn't love him. Will was cantankerous, but he's sort of like Jim Henson in the fact that he recognized talent and he would bring you in. He, instead of saying, I'm not into that, he said, hey, would you try this? Or I like what you did there. And which, the first time you and I, Bob, talked was when I called you in a rage after I saw Frank Miller's Spirit movie. So you talked me off a ledge that day.
Wow, I forgot about that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the first time we talked. And I know I called you out of the blue. So, but yeah, it's.
I talked a lot of people off the ledge around that time.
You really did. I was so enraged by that film. For a lot of complicated reasons, but because it seemed like Frank was pissing on his friendship with Will.
Yeah.
And that's Will didn't deserve that. As far as the Spirit didn't deserve that movie, we didn't deserve that movie. Yeah. Will certainly didn't deserve that film. So if I ever make it in Hollywood, that's high on my list. I have a Spirit series that I really want to pitch. But. But yeah, there's no way I'd do a magazine without Will in there.
Well, you have to get to know Brad Bird. I know he's still got an itch to
Oh yeah,
bring the spirit to the screen.
That's gorgeous.
Yeah. I think Frank Miller, after he and Will sat down for Eisner Miller, the book that they did with I want to say Chris Couch. Was it Chris Couch? Was it someone else? I think it was Chris. And that didn't go very well. Will was not prepared, and I think he hurt Miller's feelings about his own work and was not respectful. And I think after that, once Miller got his hands on the spirit, I think Miller got even with him. That's just my own personal perspective.
My feeling too.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I would point out, unrelated to the film or Frank Miller, was that, of course, there's a great story about Eisner basically was one Kevin Bacon step away from the Ramones through Legs McNeil and John Holmstrom, who started Punk Magazine. And Holmstrom was a student of Will's, and they always give Will credit for being part of the inspiration for that magazine. So I know that's something a lot of people just are not aware of.
I didn't know that either.
So that's kind of cool. So the one person who's really featured in this issue, who I'm not that familiar with, who you mentioned earlier, I know some of his run on Swamp Thing, is Steve Bissette. Mm-hmm. So school me a little bit on Steve Bissette. Why should I know Steve Bissette, and why should I, when this interview is over, go out and seek out some of his work?
Oh, actually, that's a bit of a surprise. Yes, Steve had a great run on the classic Swamp Thing with Alan Moore, Rick Beach, and John Toddleman, and had a long creative relationship with Alan Moore, which ended the same way all creative relationships with Alan Moore ended, really badly. However, his Swamp Thing run, along with Dave Sim and Sarah Aardvark, enabled him to publish this anthology book called Taboo. And it's actually Taboo is sort of what I based Exploitation Nation on. It's just a collection of talent that he respected, people that had stories that they wanted to tell that they couldn't tell anywhere else. There weren't horror anthologies at this point in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So he really wanted to bring horror back to comics. That was his main goal, was doing that, and he introduced a lot of wonderful people to the mainstream. Tim Lucas's Throat Sprockets was adapted as a comic for Taboo. Alejandro Jodorowsky did a version of El Topo for his book, and a lot of them is From Hell. Eddie Campbell and One Verse From Hell was serialized in there. He introduced Neil Gaiman's Sweeney Todd at one point. It was Steve wanting to be generous to people around and putting out the best possible magazine he could, and it was just fascinating. And now his work is mostly anything he wants to do, basically. His dream project was Tyrant, which is the story of a velociraptor without any anthropomorphizing at all. It's what was a dinosaur doing on its day life, and it's fascinating. It's beautiful. If you don't know Steve, you should go and hunt Steve out, because he's generous. He's funny. If you liked his run on Swamp, his art's gorgeous, consistently gorgeous, and he's a nice guy. And he's certainly always been generous. I met him when I want to say like 15, way back in the day, and I really take. It's not the word. I always have gratitude towards people who didn't dismiss me as a stupid kid.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't just blow me off. And those are the people I want to spotlight in publications. People who are just kind to other people.
I feel that way about a lot of people who've crossed my path career-wise over the last so many years. All right, so last question. What is next for Exploitation Nation? Do you have a focus for the next issue?
The next issue we're literally calling a free-for-all because the themes burned us out. I'm going to do a big piece on the video nasty era of the 80s, because apparently Exploitation Nation is big in Britain. So I have some sources to call upon. There's some wonderful people in Great Britain who've been working with us. This is the 20th anniversary of Happy Cloud Pictures, my production company that I run with David and Bess and my wife, and we're getting right back to some of our past films. Throughout the year, we're going to be promoting Happy Cloud Pictures, but Exploitation Nation is right there with Happy Cloud Media. It's our flagship sort of publication. We're just going to chug away. I know there's an issue planned towards the end of the year. We're going to be defending bad movies. Movies that everyone has a soft spot for some movie that's typically considered bad. And for instance, Amy has turned me on to Grease 2. Grease 2, for as much as it's maligned, it's a better made film than Grease. It has about a dozen better songs in it, and it has Michelle Pfeiffer, where the previous one didn't. So that's my defense.
How about Dr. Detroit? Will that find its way into that?
I don't know if enough people hate Dr. Detroit.
Got it. Everyone I've ever known has hated Dr. Detroit.
Really?
I found it amusing when I saw it. And
yeah, I thought it was perfect.
I made the mistake of telling someone, and they were like, "Oh my God, he's got no taste at all," and that was the end of my reputation with those people.
That's if a movie is unfairly maligned, it has a home with us. That's what we say.
That should be your catch line.
Yeah.
If a movie is unfairly maligned, it has a home with us.
We did a big piece on Forbidden Zone. The writer I assigned it didn't care for it, so I wrote a counter piece to it because I did like it, and then I asked Rick Elfman to do his point of view on it. So I have no problem with multiple points of view on one film. I think it's all valid.
Great. All right. Well, folks, listen, you can find Exploitation Nation, edited by Mike Watt, in probably great comic stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com, thanks to Amazon.com. Yes. If you are watching the video or listening to the video on MrMedia.com, if you look down the page, you'll see the cover of Exploitation Nation number 6. You can just click on it. It'll take you to Amazon. You can order it right away and get your copy. Is the magazine, the journal, is it available as an ebook or strictly print?
It's Kindle, and if you order from happycloudpictures.net, you get it for a buck less.
There you go, folks. You heard it here. And that was my next question is, I'm assuming there's a website, Twitter, Facebook. How do people find you?
happycloudpictures.net and Facebook. I think I'm Mike Watt HCP. I'm the guy who isn't the bassist. So if you go there and you see an older guy with a guitar, I look like this.
Well, the other Mike Watt, was he in Loverboy?
No, he's the Minutemen.
Oh, the Minutemen. Okay, good. Because I was going to say, the red jacket you're wearing, I was thinking Mike Watt was the Lover. No, Mike, wow, now I can't think of it, because I've got an interview with him on the site. With Mike, I can't think of it. But he was famous for his red jackets like you're wearing.
This was just clean.
Oh. Folks, talk about the secrets behind the show. Well, Mike Watt, it's great to see you face-to-face. We've spoken before. We've communicated a lot. And thank you so much for joining us today on Mr. Media.
Well, thank you, Bob. It was a great time. Thank you very much.
Receiver, turn your back on the deceiver. It's a bad idea to believe her. A bad idea to believe her. Turn up the stereo receiver. Turn up the stereo receiver.